Let's get some more analysis now from Eurasia Group President Ian Bremmer on the line from New York. And Ian, I know you have been going through every detail of this. Does it surprise you, first of all, the timing or just how quickly things accelerated?
Not at all. I wrote about this a few hours ago, that my expectation, given what Trump has said, and over the course of the last 24 hours and the dramatic shift from his earlier policy, was that we should actually expect in short order some surgical strikes against Assad. That's exactly what we've seen. We're talking about a pretty limited response against a military base. Hopefully we won't see civilian casualties, and hopefully we won't see Russian casualties. It's certainly intelligent that they informed the Russians of these attacks in advance of the strike, so clearly there wasn't much time. And if that's the case, if it's truly all we see for the time being is what we've seen this evening, then I would not expect significant escalation from Moscow or from Tehran. We've seen, for example, the Israelis engage in surgical strikes against the Assad regime in the past. They've gotten away with it. What the question is going to be whether this gets the Americans on a slippery slope towards more military engagement against the Assad regime. And if we see that, it's a very different story. But for now, that decision has not been taken.
There's been a couple of mentions about, needing a complete strategy that needs to be followed through. What is that? What does that strategy look like? And does that then change your assessment of what the other responses would be?
Yeah, well, again, there's no reason necessarily to expect a dramatic change in strategy. As you saw under Obama, there was an effort to remove Assad, and that effort was in part just a general series of statements, and in part it was an effort to engage with the Russians and others politically. The latter failed. The question will be, can Trump succeed where Obama failed? And the fact that we now have these chemical attacks by the Assad regime, which looks pretty firm, does provide an opening for the Trump administration to press the Russians and others to have a political transition process that does not include Assad. Now, so far, there's no reason to believe that the Russians are remotely going to go along with this. But there's clearly a diplomatic opening. And what I heard from Secretary of State Tillerson earlier today before the strikes was that there is already an effort to move towards a transition. That doesn't mean regime change. That doesn't mean a decapitation strike against Assad. That means that Trump and the Trump administration now wants Assad out in the near term, as opposed to what they were saying 2 days ago, which was not a priority. And so what we need to see is to what extent direct bilateral conversations between the Americans and the Russians are a move in that direction. Also, where are the Iranians? Because the Russians can't get this done by themselves. The Iranians militarily are actually much more important on the ground in Syria than Moscow is. Final point here is that it was very interesting to see a Kremlin spokesperson earlier today say that the Russian support for Assad was not unconditional. Now, they've said that before, and in part that's because they have limited leverage over Assad, who is very much his own actor despite Russian support. But the timing of that, after the Trump administration had escalated the way they had, is clearly not coincidental. So, again, I do think there is actually an opening here for the Trump administration as long as they don't further escalate.